At 5 o'clock Eastern, lawmakers will vote to confirm that nominee a half hour later. After that, we expect debate on a campaign finance disclosure rule. The House gavels in tomorrow at 2 with a discussion on defense spending cuts known as sequestration. Watch the House live on C-SPAN. And now we go live to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, who keeps us in your love, forgive us when we give our best to the wrong things. Keep us from becoming annoyed and angry about things which in our calmer moments we know do not matter. Give our lawmakers this day the wisdom to know what is important and what is unimportant, so that they will never forget the things that truly matter. Help them, Lord, to never let the things that do not matter to matter too much. Give them in all their duties your help, in all their perplexities your guidance, and in all their dangers your protection. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 16, 2012. To the Senate, on the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Christopher A. Coons, Senator from the State of Delaware, to perform the duties of the Chair, signed Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka. Mr. Alexander.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to calendar number 446S3369, the Disclose Act.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 446S3369, a bill to amend the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 and so forth, and for other purposes.
Then, Mr. President, at 5 p.m. the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the nomination of Kevin McNulty to be United States District Judge for the District of New Jersey. At 5:30 p.m. there will be two roll call votes. The first vote will be on confirmation of the McNulty nomination. There will then be 10 minutes of debate prior to a cloture vote on the motion to proceed to the Disclose Act. Mr. President, I'm told that H.R. 6079 is at the desk and is due for a second reading.
Clerk will read the title of both the second time.
H.R. 6079, an act to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and health care-related provisions in the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010.
Mr. President, I now object to any further proceedings to this matter now.
Objections heard. Bill will be placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
Mr. President, Thomas Jefferson one of our great presidents, once said, quote, "The end of democracy will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed corporations." Campaign finance reforms, protections that we have in place and have had for many, many years have solved the problem that Jefferson talked about by limiting political spending by corporations. Then, out of nowhere, came the Supreme Court and issued its Citizens United opinion, rolling back a century of work to make elections transparent and credible. The result of Citizens United has been a flood of corporate special interest campaign spending by shadowy front-run groups with questionable motives. Not since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican who put a stop to unlimited corporate donations, has America seen this kind of out-of-control spending to influence elections. Democrats and a majority of Americans believe the Supreme Court got it very, very, very wrong with Citizens United. Anonymous spending by so-called nonprofits, often backed by huge corporate donors or a few wealthy individuals, used to make up 1% of election spending. This year will make up well over half the spending. There's no question the Citizens United decision opened the door for big corporations and foreign entities to secretly spend hundreds of millions of dollars to influence elections, undermining the fairness and integrity of the process. Let's look at Nevada, Mr. President. Through the first part of this year, more money has been spent per capita on TV ads in Nevada than in any other state in the country. Most of the ads have been funded by anonymous groups, flush with cash from these huge oil interests, Wall Street moneyed interests, foreign gambling interests, and other industries seeking greater influence in Washington. Voters in Nevada and across the country deserve to know who paid for these ads. We've proven that it's possible to remove the veil of secrecy from outside money and make the process more transparent. We've done that before. We need to do it again. We can require large political donors to disclose their identities so voters can at least judge their motivations for themselves. Requiring large donors to disclose their identities is not a new concept. In fact, my counterpart, Senator McConnell, and many of his Republican colleagues have supported this in the past. The legislation today before the Senate, the Disclose Act, would require disclosure of donations in excess of $10,000 if they're used for campaign purposes. The bill treats all political entities, whether unions, corporations, business associations, or super PACs, the same. They're treated equally. And contrary to Republican claims, this legislation would not require organizations to turn over membership rosters or a list of grassroots donors. That is foolishness. Rather, it would prevent corporations and wealthy individuals from using front groups to shield their donations from disclosure. Yet my Republican colleagues, with rare exception, have lined up against this common sense legislation. Their newfound opposition to transparency makes one wonder who they're trying to protect. Perhaps Republicans want to shield a handful of billionaires willing to contribute 9 figures to sway a close presidential election. Mr. President, if this flood of outside money continues, the day after the election, 17 angry old white men will wake up and realize they've just bought the country. That's a sad commentary. About 60% or more of these outside dollars are coming from these 17 people. These donors have something in common with their nominee. Like Mitt Romney, they believe they play by their own set of rules. Mitt Romney has refused to release his tax returns. I think everyone in America now knows that. From the one and only return we've seen, we know Mitt Romney pays a lower tax rate than most middle-class families. We know he has a Swiss bank account. We know he takes advantage of tax shelters in the Cayman Islands and tax shelters in Bermuda. But we can only guess what new secrets would be revealed if we could examine a dozen years of his tax returns. His father, George Romney, set the standard for presidential elections. He released 12 years of tax returns so Americans then could evaluate his record for themselves. His son should also let his records out so we can evaluate his record for ourselves. Even nominees for cabinet posts are required to release 3 years of tax returns and declare financial holdings worth more than $1,000. Romney's refusal to be open and honest would disqualify him from even being a cabinet secretary. And his penchant for secrecy makes Americans wonder, what's he hiding? Thomas Jefferson famously argued that democracy depends on an informed electorate. If that's true, and I believe it is, it stands to reason that disclosure can only strengthen our democracy. But don't take my word for it. As my friend Senator McConnell has said, and I quote, "Disclosure is the best disinfectant." End of quote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. You say aunt.
So, waiting for senators to come back to the floor here. General speech is going on now in the Senate. Work turns about 5 o'clock this afternoon to a judicial nomination. Lawmakers will vote to confirm that nominee about 5:30. Then we expect debate on campaign finance disclosure rules. The House out today, but they gavel in tomorrow at 2 o'clock. They'll have a discussion on defense spending cuts, the cuts known as sequestration. We have live House coverage for you on C-SPAN and always the Senate here on C-SPAN 2. Over on C-SPAN 3 right now, we have a program live that we're bringing you about the so-called fiscal cliff with Democratic Senator Patty Murray. That started about 15 minutes ago. You can watch that live. And on C-SPAN this afternoon, the Wilson Center hosting a discussion on the situation in Syria and the continuing violence in that country. That got underway at noon Eastern. Our coverage of the Senate continues, and you can always follow all of these events on our website, cspan.org.
Mr. President.
The Republican.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, later today, Senate Democrats will show where their legislative priorities truly lie. At a moment when the American people are reeling from the slowest economic recovery in modern times, and just 5.5 months away from a combination of tax hikes and spending cuts already being referred to around the world as America's fiscal cliff, Senate Democrats want us to waste our time on the Disclose Act, a bill that has only two discernible purposes: to create the impression of mischief where there is none, and to send a signal to unions that Democrats are just as eager to do their legislative bidding as ever. Think about it. We've had 41 straight months of unemployment above 8%. It's been more than 3 years since the Democratic Senate passed a budget. But this is what they want to do? For months, Republicans have been urging Democrats to do something about the approaching fiscal cliff now, before it's too late. The American people don't expect us to see every crisis that comes around the corner, but they should be able to expect us to do something about the problems we do see, that we know are coming. Yet last week, President Obama signaled that he and his campaign advisors think it's good politics to keep the threat of these looming tax hikes on everyone right on the table as supposed leverage in an effort to raise taxes on nearly a million business owners right now. And as the Washington Post reported this morning, not only do Democrats in Congress agree with him, they're ready and willing to go right off the fiscal cliff if they don't get their way. In their near fanatical crusade to inflict even more pain on American businesses, Democrats are now openly admitting that they plan to wait until this debate reaches full throttle and Americans are panicked about the outcome to do anything, because they think it will make it likelier they'll get their way. And if they don't, then so be it. So be it. They're ready to accept the economic and fiscal consequences. They see a crisis coming, and they don't want to waste it. The Congressional Budget Office has said that not doing anything and walking off this fiscal cliff would lead to a recession. The IMF, its chief, says it would threaten the global economy. And yet Senate Democrats, Senate Democrats today are announcing they're perfectly ready and willing to accept all that if Republicans don't allow them to raise taxes on the very businesses that we're counting on to create the jobs that we need. This, Mr. President, is what passes for governance among Democrats these days. Put the American people up against a wall, pick their pockets, and that hope in the midst of the scuffle they blame it and the recession that would follow on the Republicans. Now let's make no mistake. What the Democrats are proposing today is an entirely avoidable high-stakes game of chicken with the single-minded goal of taking more money from those who earn it for government to waste. Taking more money from those who earn it for the government to waste. The President made it very clear over the weekend that he doesn't think entrepreneurs are responsible for their own success. They owe it to the government. Successful entrepreneurs owe their success to the government. That's the attitude driving everything this President and his Democratic allies in Washington are doing right now. Their one-point plan for getting America back on track is clear. You earn, we take. And if they don't get to impose it, then they'll welcome a recession. They're so single-mindedly focused on taking the earnings of others for themselves and spreading it around, in the President's famous phrase, that they're recklessly ignoring any proposal to prevent the coming crisis in order to achieve it. Now, last week, Senate Republicans proposed a legislative solution which ensures that no one sees their income tax go up, no one, at the end of the year. That creates a path for the kind of fair, broad-based, comprehensive tax reform members of both parties claim they want, and which would give individuals and businesses the certainty that they've been asking us to give them since the very beginning of the administration. We could have passed this completely reasonable proposal last week and put the anxieties of millions of Americans at ease with a single vote. But Democrats, of course, refused. They'd rather keep the crisis unresolved, keep it looming out there on the horizon. They think it gives them a political edge. They think it's good politics. They should be ashamed. They should be ashamed. Consider this. It's been nearly a year since the President demanded $500 billion in automatic cuts to defense at the end of this year, and yet with the date now fast approaching, we still don't know how he intends to handle it. The President's campaign wants people asking whether his opponent is hiding something on a 10-year-old tax return. How about what this President is actually concealing about his plans to slash defense? With just a few months to go before these cuts devastate communities all across the country, the President has yet to outline his plans. Republicans in the House have already passed, and Senate Republicans have proposed concrete plans to avoid these devastating cuts to our national defense. Our uniformed military deserve the certainty that their operations, training, support, and weapon systems will be fully funded. Meanwhile, the President hasn't demonstrated the least bit of interest in this issue. No interest whatsoever. He hasn't said a thing. He's apparently more interested in blowing smoke about his opponent's tax returns than in talking about the tax hike he actually plans to impose on the very businesses we're counting on to create the jobs Americans need, not some other day, but right now. He'd rather spend his time raising unfounded suspicions about a guy whose entire professional career has been a dress rehearsal for bringing order to a government that's become so bloated, so inefficient, and so bureaucratic that it's crying out for the kind of leadership and reform Democrats simply refuse to provide. He'd rather attack a guy who has succeeded at just about everything he's ever done than propose a solution himself. And the reason, of course, is perfectly clear. Washington Democrats are worried he might succeed at reforming government, too. They don't want to give him the chance. Think about it. The economy is flat on its back. Millions are struggling to find work. And Democrats aren't outlining a solution. They're plotting about how to take advantage of it to advance an ideological agenda most Americans oppose, and to cast doubt about anybody who poses a serious threat to the crony, capitalist, bureaucratic favor factory right here in Washington. Where the rest of us see the worst economic recovery in modern times, Democrats see another opportunity to use a crisis to grow the government, and that's what they're focused on. Not on providing hope and relief for already struggling Americans, but providing more tax dollars for the government to waste and misdirect. And in the meantime, they'll waste our time with bills like this one, which they know won't pass, but which will give them a chance to make a fuss about a problem that doesn't exist and blow a kiss to the unions for good measure. But if we're going to have to vote on proceeding this bill, I'd like to take a moment to explain why it's not only Exhibit A and how completely irresponsible Democrats are being right now, but why it is such a terrible idea in itself. First, a point on process. When the history books are written, the 112th Congress may well be known as the Congress of Irrelevant Committees. The Congress of Irrelevant Committees. There once was a day when committees held hearings on bills, debated them, offered amendments, and reported them out for full Senate consideration. Now it's find a bill, put it on the calendar, move to proceed, file cloture, lose, and repeat. That's today's Senate. Find a bill, put it on the calendar, move to proceed, file cloture, and repeat. That's today's United States Senate. Committees aren't being used to generate good legislation. In other words, they're viewed as an obstacle to overcome in the effort to make a point in front of the cameras on the Senate floor. And the latest such effort is the Disclose Act, a bill that aimed at doing something about people exercising their First Amendment right to participate in the process. Well, my question is, doing something about what? Do something about races which previously would not have been competitive but now are? Do something about individuals and organizations criticizing unpopular positions and policies? Do something about groups advocating on behalf of their members to promote or oppose the very positions for which their members join? As George Will has pointed out, the political process isn't a private club, with the parties and the candidates controlling membership. And under the Citizens United decision of 2010, independent groups are not able to speak again under the First Amendment, regardless of who, when, and what they're speaking about. This is something Democrats should be celebrating, not excoriating. The founders envisioned a nation in which speech would be promoted as widely as possible. That's what the First Amendment is all about, particularly when it comes to the political process. Now, the purpose of this legislation is totally clear. After Citizens United, Democrats realized they couldn't shut up their critics. So they decided to go after the microphone instead by trying to scare off the funders. As Senator Schumer put it during a debate on an earlier version of this bill, and I quote, "The deterrent effect should not be underestimated." Senator Schumer, on the real purpose of this bill, the deterrent effect should not be underestimated. Just as with the Disclose Act of 2010, this amounts to nothing more than member and donor harassment and intimidation. And it's all part of a broader government-led intimidation effort by this administration. There are parallel efforts going on at the FCC, the SEC, the IRS, the DOJ, and the White House itself to silence its critics. The creation of a modern-day Nixonian enemies list is currently in full swing, and frankly, the American people should not stand for it. As I've said before, no individual or group in this country should have to face harassment or intimidation or incur crippling expenses defending themselves against their own government, simply because the government doesn't like the message they're advocating. But that's what we're seeing. My own view has always been that if you can't convince people of the wisdom of your policies, then you need to come up with some better arguments. Instead, the left has resorted to tactics like the pending legislation. This legislation is an unprecedented requirement for groups to publicly disclose their donors, stripping a protection recognized and solidified by the courts. As a result of this legislation, advocacy groups ranging from the NAACP to the Sierra Club to the Chamber of Commerce, all of whom already disclosed their donors to the IRS, would now be forced to subject their members to public intimidation and harassment. Why? Why? For supporting organizations and groups whose goals they agree with. Now, predictably, unions are exempted from the kind of disclosure Democrats now want to impose on everybody else. The so-called stand by your ad provision in an earlier version has done a David Copperfield and entirely vanished. I'm not advocating for the provision, but simply to note its absence, which proves that the primary goal of this bill is not good government or transparency, but targeted speech suppression. That's what this is about, targeted speech suppression. I have to give the authors credit, whoever they are. They actually list labor unions as a covered organization in the bill. However, through an elaborate scheme of thresholds and triggers, they might as well have saved the ink, since unions are largely given a free pass by this bill, despite the fact that they're by far the biggest players in political campaigns in our entire country. No one else comes close. Almost all of it, of course, on the Democratic side. As the Wall Street Journal reported last week, labor unions spent a total of $4.4 billion on campaigns from 2005 to 2011. A staggering amount of money, and perfectly within their rights, I would add, under the First Amendment. So let's be clear. The other side may be able to whip the media up into a lather over the increased participation of individuals and groups who don't like the direction this president has taken our country. But the really big money is coming from the left in the form of mandatory dues to labor unions. To the left, big money from individuals and corporations is a problem. But the nearly $800 million spent by unions in 2008, oh, that's just fine and dandy. As long as nearly 100% of it goes to their own campaigns. As supporters of this legislation have readily admitted, the real target of this bill is to protect themselves from criticism over their wildly unpopular policies and positions. This is precisely why this legislation has been opposed by business groups from coast to coast and opposed by everyone from the NRA, which is key voting this vote, to the ACLU, to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I greatly appreciate all the effort these folks have put into educating and advocating on this issue. So, Mr. President, I'll certainly do everything in my power to protect the First Amendment rights from disclose, the sequel. And I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join with me in voting no. We have many serious problems in this country. Too much free speech is not one of them. Now, Democrats can call this bill whatever they want, but they can't conceal its true intent, which is to encourage their allies and discourage their critics from exercising their First Amendment right to speak their minds. If Democrats don't like the level playing field ensured by the First Amendment and reaffirmed by Citizens United, they should do a better job convincing the American people of the wisdom of their policies and focus on real problems instead of inventing ones that don't exist. To this point, I would once again urge our friends to put the political games aside and do something now about the fiscal cliff that's approaching before it's too late. Our nation has been mired in an economic coma for years. More people signed up for disability last month than found a job. More people signed up for disability last month than found a job. The number of Americans on food stamps continues to climb. It's all about to get worse. And we've got a president who's on a single-minded crusade to punish business owners even more. Now, Republicans have proposed serious, concrete ideas for addressing the problems we face. But we can't do any of it if the President and his Democratic allies in Congress refuse to join us. Unfortunately, that's where we are. Democrats have made their priorities perfectly clear, and sadly, the American people they were elected to serve appear to be very much at the bottom of the list. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent that the Senator from Arkansas now be recognized to deliver remarks regarding a casualty from his home state, for which I'll take this opportunity to extend my condolences and the condolences of the people of Rhode Island, and then that at the conclusion of his remarks that I be recognized.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the Senator very much for yielding me a few minutes.
The Senator from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. President, we are aware that our freedoms are not truly free, and our soldiers give the greatest sacrifice in freedom's defense. The sacrifices of Americans in uniform and their families embody the courage, honor, and patriotism that we must always remember. Today, I am here to pay my respects to Army Sergeant Michael Strakota, an Arkansas soldier who sacrificed his life for the love of this country in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Sergeant Strakota graduated from Pine Bluff High School in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 2002. In 2007, he enlisted in the Army and was assigned to the 96th Transportation Company, 180th Transportation Battalion, 13th Sustainment Command at Fort Hood, Texas. Sergeant Strakota was aware of the dangers that he faced, having served a previous deployment to Iraq in 2009. His family says that Michael was proud of his job, and he recalled to Arkansas newspapers how excited he was about his position and how he wanted to pursue a new direction in the military as an Army Ranger or pilot. Sergeant Strakota's family said he was known for his friendly, outgoing, and generous nature, his love for the outdoors, and riding motorcycles. Most of all, he was devoted to his family. He delayed his R&R to be with his son on his birthday on July the 5th. Mr. President, Sergeant Michael Strakota answered the highest call for this country. He is a true American hero. I ask my colleagues to keep his wife Lauren, his son William, and the rest of the family and friends in their thoughts and prayers during these very, very difficult times. I humbly offer my sincerest gratitude for his selfless service and patriotism for this nation. And with that, I yield back.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about the Disclose Act of 2012, a piece of legislation that will shine some much-needed light into the flood of secret money that is now polluting our elections. I'd like to open with thanks to Senators Chuck Schumer, Mike Bennett, Al Franken, Jeff Merkley, Jeanne Shaheen, and Tom Udall for their hard work in our task force that developed this legislation, and I look forward to continuing to work with them through this debate. On Thursday, Majority Leader Reid moved to proceed to this vital piece of legislation, and we will vote on it this evening. I thank the leader. I and many of my colleagues are looking forward to the opportunity to make the case for this important measure. But in a sense, for the American public, the case has already been made. As anyone who watches television knows, our airwaves are filled with political attack ads. The organizations paying for many of these ads have patriotic and benign-sounding names with words like prosperity and freedom and future frequently to be found. These names sound harmless, but all too often the ads are actually paid for by secret special interests, billionaires and wealthy corporations seeking secret special influence in our democracy, and in the process drowning out the voices of regular American families who wish to participate in elections. The Republican leader indicated that we were going after the impression of mischief where there is none. Well, many Americans certainly have the impression of mischief. As USA Today put it last week in an editorial supporting this Disclose Act, everybody's watching what's expected to be by far the most expensive presidential campaign in history, and not without a dose of horror. Freed by the Supreme Court from spending limits, all manner of special interests are opening the spigots to buy influence. Here's how my home state paper, the Providence Journal, explained the Citizens United decision that unleashed this torrent of special interest money. The ruling will mean that more than ever, big spending economic interests will determine who gets elected. More money will especially pour into relentless attack campaigns. Free speech for most individuals will suffer because their voices will count for even less than they do now. They will simply be drowned out by the big money. End quote. And I think the Providence Journal hit the nail right on the head. What has happened since the Citizens United decision has in fact proven them right. Senator John McCain said earlier this year, the United States Supreme Court, in what I think is one of the worst decisions in history, struck down the restrictions in the so-called McCain-Feingold law. And a lot of people don't agree with that. But I predicted when the United States Supreme Court, with their absolute ignorance of what happens in politics, struck down that law, that there would be a flood of money into campaigns, not transparent, unaccounted for, and this is exactly what is happening. And Senator McCain is right. This is exactly what is happening. It is not an impression of mischief. It is mischief on the loose. Richard Posner, a leading conservative legal scholar and a federal judge, recently said that, and I'll quote, "Our political system is pervasively corrupt due to our Supreme Court taking away campaign contribution restrictions on the basis of the First Amendment. Our political system is pervasively corrupt." This from a conservative federal judge. The impact of Citizens United has been very clear. In the 2010 midterm elections, the first after Citizens United, there was a more than four-fold increase in expenditures from super PACs and other outside groups compared with 2006, 69 million up to 305 million, with nearly three-quarters of political advertising coming from sources that were prohibited from spending money back in 2006. Also in 2010, those 501c4 and C6 not-for-profit organizations spent more than $135 million in unlimited and secret political contributions. Anonymous spending rose from 1% of outside spending in 2006, as that graph just showed, to 44% in 2010. We're already seeing the influence of money on the 2012 elections. Super PACs and other outside groups have spent over $150 million in this election cycle, about twice what was spent over the same period in 2008 during the last presidential election. Non-disclosing groups, said the New York Times, have accounted for two-thirds of the political advertising bought by the biggest outside spenders so far in the 2012 election cycle, with close to $100 million in ads. Campaigns are no longer waged by candidates and parties fighting over ideas. They are now waged by shadowy political attack groups posing as social welfare organizations run by the likes of Karl Rove and other political operatives and fueled by millions of undisclosed dollars from secret special interests. When these secret special interests take over our elections this way, it drowns out the voices of regular individual Americans. And it puts in jeopardy some of the key pillars of a strong middle class, pillars like Medicare, Social Security, and Pell Grants that have paved the way for generations to achieve the American dream, but have always been the targets of special interests. These special interests have motives. They have motives to spend this kind of money. And if those motives were good for America, if they were welcome to the average American, they wouldn't need and they wouldn't want to keep them secret. So we need to ask ourselves a very important question. What are they hiding? Why do they demand secrecy? Whatever their answer, one thing is clear. Americans who worry that Washington is too beholden to special interests now need to be concerned more than ever. Hang on to your wallets. Here come the special interests, and you won't even know who they are. As recently reported in the New York Times, secret spending groups have accounted for two-thirds of this advertising. Two-thirds of ad spending from groups other than candidates or parties has come from secretive corporations and billionaires whose names and agendas the voters may never know, and who will have no accountability for how that money is spent. Impression of mischief indeed. And of course, when you don't have accountability, there's no limit to the things that people will say. One of the restraints on the vitriol and the filth that so often is part of the American political debate is that candidates have to stand by their ads. And if you say something that is awful, if you engage in relentless negative attacks, voters may charge you a price for that. They may find that unwelcome. Well, that, of course, disappears when the name behind the ad is attached to no living person or corporation. It's just an entity. It's a sham. It's a phony. It's a shell. So how has this worked out? Well, not well for the American public. An April study found that about 70% of ads in this election cycle have been negative, up from only 9% through the same period in 2008. In 2008, 9% of ads in that time period, 9% had been negative. In this cycle, 70% have been negative. And over the last 6 months, if you look at the 4 top spending political 501c4 organizations, the ones that don't have to disclose their donors, they spent an estimated 85% of their election spending on ads containing deceptions. On ads containing deceptions, 85%. So 70% of the stuff out there is negative, up from only 9%, and 85% of the big spenders are spending their money on ads that have been determined to be deceptive. The names of these organizations, they all sound lovely: Americans for Prosperity, American Future Fund, American Energy Alliance, and Crossroads GPS. Without knowing who funds these shadowy groups, the American voter has no idea what mischief they really are up to. This is all the result of the Supreme Court's disastrous and misguided decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This decision that opened the floodgates to unlimited and secret corporate and special interest money pouring into our elections. This chart shows just how easy it is under our current system for wealthy interests to skirt existing disclosure rules and spend secret millions in election ads. This amounts to a form of legalized political money laundering, or, to use the phrase that Senator McCain and I used in our brief to the Supreme Court, identity laundering. Super PACs are supposed to disclose their donors under current law, but that can sometimes be weeks or months after a deceptive ad runs. But if a donor wants to avoid even that disclosure, it can just set up a shell corporation, which may be nothing more than a P.O. box someplace, and send the money to the super PAC through that shell corporation without a real person's name ever showing up on a disclosure form. You just launder it through your shell corporation, and next thing you know, your money's off doing work. Worse still, instead of using a shell corporation, you can pass the money through a 501c4 social welfare organization. And I put the word social welfare in quotes because that's the IRS phrase that is used for these kind of organizations. There is very little social welfare that's being accomplished by the big political donor groups known as social welfare organizations. The IRS gives nonprofit status to these groups whose primary purpose is, and in many cases their only purpose, is to shield big spenders from having their identities disclosed. In many cases, the 501c4 so-called social welfare groups are so closely affiliated with the super PACs that they have all the same staff and the same office space. It's a 501c4 independent social welfare organization for the IRS with the same staff and the same office space as a super PAC. Please. And of course, the 501c4 groups still don't have to disclose their donors, even when they're the same staff and the same office as a super PAC. On this chart, we see the money raised by one of them. After Citizens United, Republican political operatives, including Karl Rove, raised money through the Crossroads PAC. It is a super PAC, and it is supposed to disclose its donor. But it has attached to it Crossroads GPS, a 501c4 group that is not the super PAC, and it can maintain complete secrecy for its donors. Guess which one has raised the most money? It's an easy question. It's this 501c4 group that doesn't have to disclose its donors. The group raised $76.8 million through 2011, as opposed to only $46.4 million raised by its sister super PAC. And this is by no means a unique situation. As the New York Times wrote in an editorial last Sunday in support of the Disclose Act, corporations love the secrecy provided by Mr. Rove's group because it protects them from scrutiny by nosy shareholders and consumers. They want a big influence on elections, but without leaving any tracks. An unnamed corporate lobbyist told the newspaper Politico earlier this year that non-disclosure is always preferred by corporate donors. Why is it preferred? Because it makes it impossible for the public and law enforcement to track down the corrupting influence of the money that these corporations spend in elections. The Disclose Act put an end to this nonsense. It puts an end to using 501c4 groups and shell corporations to shield the identities of big donors. One thing that should not be lost in the discussion of anonymous spending is the fact that there is one person to whom this spending is never anonymous, and that is the candidate who is either being benefited or punished. Although the donors have managed to hide their identities from the public, they can sure tell the candidate how much money they're putting into the candidate's super PAC and, by the way, what position they want that candidate to take on issues. What this creates is a perfect recipe for corruption, a perfect recipe for corruption. Wealthy corporations and individuals, special interests, secretly spending millions of dollars to influence a candidate in ways that the public never sees. A rich donor can secretly threaten massive spending against a candidate without even putting the money up. If the candidate doesn't take the right position on an issue, then they pull the trigger. But they can make the threat just quietly. Political scientist Norm Ornstein recently said, "I've had this tale told to me by a number of lawmakers. You're sitting in your office and a lobbyist comes in and says, 'I'm working with Americans for a Better America,' or, I don't know, Americans for Future Prosperity. And I can't tell you who's funding them, but I can tell you they really, really want this amendment in the bill. And who knows what they'll do. They've got more money than God." That's the end of the quote. If the candidate complies, of course, the expenditure is never made, there is no paper trail, and no trace of that threat. And yet, the system has been corrupted. Let's also dispense with the fiction that this spending is independent. The whole rationale for unlimited spending was that it was to be done independently of candidate campaigns. The reality is that super PACs are anything but independent. Campaigns and super PACs share fundraising lists, donors, former staff, consultants. Candidates appear at fundraisers for their super PACs. Super PACs recycle ads that were originally run by the candidates. They share film. They're free to act as the evil twins of candidate campaigns, as one FEC commissioner put it, raising unlimited secret money and then spending it on massive amounts of advertising, most of it negative, to benefit their preferred candidate. Our campaign finance system is broken, and it lends itself to corruption in new and unprecedented ways. Immediate action is required to fix it. Today we're debating a bill that will at least bring some transparency and accountability into this election spending. This should not be a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, and in the past it has not been. It has always had bipartisan support because it's about protecting our democratic process. We need to pass the Disclose Act now. As the USA Today editorial said, Citizens United left the public only one way to protect itself from the rising threat: disclosure. At the federal level, this would be achieved by the Disclose Act. I thank USA Today for supporting this bill. The Supreme Court also made it crystal clear in that very Citizens United decision that disclosure was an appropriate and even a necessary part of a healthy campaign finance system. Here's what Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, writing for the majority. I quote, "Prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits. And citizens can see whether elected officials are in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests," end quote. The new version of the Disclose Act will do exactly this. It says nothing more and nothing less that when corporations and other wealthy interests spend money, more than $10,000, to influence our elections, their identities must be disclosed. And there's no question where the American people stand on this. Americans of all political stripes are disgusted by the influence of unlimited, anonymous corporate cash in our elections, and by the campaigns that succeed or fail, depending on how many billionaires the candidate has in his pocket. More, or vice versa, perhaps. More and more people feel their government responds only to wealthy and corporate interests. They see their jobs disappear. They see their wages stagnate. They see bailouts and special deals for the big guys, and they lose faith that their elected officials will listen to them. 6 in 10 Americans say that the middle class will not catch a break in this economy until we reduce the influence of lobbyists, big banks, and big donors. 7 in 10 Americans nearly, including a majority both of Democrats and Republicans, agree that, and I quote, "New rules that let corporations, unions, and people give unlimited money to super PACs will lead to corruption." Notwithstanding what the NRA and the Chamber and other big D.C. lobbying powerhouses want, they are at odds with the regular American people. Indeed, 1 in 4 Americans says they're actually less likely to vote because big donors to super PACs have so much more influence over elected officials than average Americans. These numbers should be a call to arms for anyone who believes that our American democracy is one of our world's shining jewels and should be scrupulously, carefully, ardently protected. Indeed, people are answering this call to arms in numbers that are increasing every day. I've got with me today here on the Senate floor $213,000 Americans, 213,000 citizen co-sponsors of this Disclose Act, which were collected by Credo Action. You can leaf through them, and you can see people from Apple Valley, Minnesota, from San Francisco, California, from Ashland, Oregon, from Austin, Texas, from Long Beach, New York, from Imperial, Nebraska, from Yorktown Heights, New York, from Brick, New Jersey, from Schaumburg, Illinois, people from all across the country, nearly 250,000 of them now, who coming from all 50 states, more than 1,000 Rhode Islanders in this group. Unlike the corporations and the billionaires who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to buy our elections and who insist on doing it in secret, these regular people are unashamed to stand up for what they believe in. Their pride in civic engagement reflects the best values of America, and their numbers show that this is an issue where a broad cross-section of Americans demand a change to what is happening in our elections. As Justice Antonin Scalia has written, I'll quote him, "Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed." Our friends who have signed on as citizen co-sponsors have that courage, and the biggest campaign spenders in the world should as well. Frankly, even those big campaign spenders should be patriotic enough to understand, as Justice Scalia did, that democracy is doomed without civic courage, and they should step up on their own. But instead, they're hiding behind the rules and hiding their identities and trying to buy influence. I'll conclude by saying that prior to Citizens United, there was a long bipartisan tradition supporting laws that required disclosure of spending in elections. This bipartisan consensus may be reemerging. Senator John McCain of Arizona and I recently filed with the Supreme Court a brief that urged the court to reconsider the flawed premise of its decision in Citizens United, the false premise that independent expenditures can't lead to corruption or the appearance of corruption. As the statistics about anonymous spending and public perception that I've cited make clear, this premise has been fully discredited. Although the Supreme Court declined this opportunity to put our elections back on a saner path, I'm proud to have worked in a bipartisan fashion on that brief with Senator McCain, who has long been a leader in this Congress and in this country on campaign finance issues. And I hope that our partnership will mark the beginning of greater cooperation across party lines on this issue of vital importance to our democracy. There are some misconceptions about the act that have colored the public debate. We plan to explain during the course of the debate why the critics of this bill have gotten so many things just plain wrong. This act contains only the most basic provisions requiring outside groups to disclose campaign-related funding, fundraising, and spending. The legislation has been streamlined from the Disclose Act that nearly passed the Senate in 2010. It places fewer burdens on covered organizations. It contains no prohibitions on spending, no special exemptions for any group or type of group. Contrary to what the Republican leader said, it does not require grassroots organizations to disclose their donors, and it treats every organization exactly the same right across the board. Some have complained, like a Republican witness in the Rules Committee hearing on this bill, that the so-called stand-by-your-ad requirements originally in the bill were too burdensome. He described them actually as radical. So we removed them. We have tried to accommodate. I know that many of my colleagues, like Senator Ron Wyden, who has authored this stand-by-your-ad legislation and has heroically fought for it for many years, remain great supporters of that provision, and I hope that we'll be able to introduce it at another time. But we didn't. So that complaint should be closed off. Some complain that this was just an attempt to influence this election. Well, its effective date is January 1st, 2013. So it will not, to the regret of many, influence this election. According to Republican former FEC Chairman Trevor Potter, the Disclose Act of 2012 is appropriately targeted, narrowly tailored, clearly constitutional, and desperately needed. So I stand ready to work with any of my colleagues, Democrats or Republicans, who want to make this bill better. But we can't use complaints, particularly unjustified complaints, as an excuse to do nothing. While the status quo of unlimited secret money may work to benefit some politicians for the moment, in the long run it will hurt us all, regardless of party. Unlimited money is not a force that anyone can ultimately hope to control, and unlimited secret money is even more dangerous. More important, the American people, who are already beginning to lose faith in our electoral system, can reasonably fear that their elected officials will only care about the anonymous donors writing 8-figure checks in deals and gifts that they will never see. Many of my Republican colleagues in the Senate know this, and they've supported disclosure in the past. Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, for instance, was once a great advocate for disclosure. As he said in 2000, Republicans are in favor of disclosure, adding, quote, "Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure?" That question is as timely today as it was then. I hope my Republican colleagues will join us in passing this important piece of legislation. Help us restore the fundamental principle of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. As the Washington Post wrote yesterday in an editorial supporting this Disclose Act, we'd like to see a few courageous Republicans rise in the Senate on Monday and declare, enough is enough. If our friends across the aisle decide to block this legislation, which clearly reflects the will of the American people, I am prepared to force this issue by debating this bill long into the night. If they're unwilling to join us in our mission to shine a light on secret money in elections, we'll keep the lights on here. I urge my colleagues to support the Disclose Act of 2012. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to speak in morning business for 15 minutes.
Without objection.